Do protests work? Like a lot of us, I've spent more hours than I care to admit in the early days of 2026 doom scrolling through my social media feeds. I didn't plan on it, but here we are. And last night, somewhere between outrage and exhaustion, I came across a short clip of Rachel Maddow on Jimmy Kimmel Live. Kimmel asked her a simple question, what a lot of people are asking right now. Do protests actually work? Or are they just a place for angry people to gather together and be angry? Maddow's answer stopped me cold. She said, in political science terms, there's something called the 3.5% rule. If 3.5% of a country's population engages in sustained nonviolent protest against an authoritarian regime, that movement becomes essentially unstoppable. Not symbolic, not inspirational, unstoppable. And she added something else that really caught my attention. It's not that much larger than what we're already seeing in the streets. Now, I spent over 3 decades in professional political consulting, and I'll be honest, I'd never heard it framed this way. And it sounded like it made perfect sense and no sense at all at the same time, so I dug a little deeper. And it turns out that there's something very real behind it. See, the murder of Renee Nicole Good by an ICE agent in Minneapolis ignited something that had been building quietly for months, maybe longer. Within days, protests erupted in hundreds of cities. Connecticut, Minnesota, South Florida, Texas, California, red states, blue states. People held signs reading ICE out for good. They demanded accountability from a federal agency that had just killed an unarmed woman. And what made this moment different wasn't just the scale. It was the spontaneity. These weren't protests triggered by a national email blast. They weren't organized by a central command. And they weren't what MAGA critics immediately claimed, paid protesters bust in for a paycheck. Now, this was Americans deciding independently and simultaneously that silence was complicity. They found each other in town squares and in downtown intersections, outside of federal buildings. Not because they were told to, but because something inside of them clicked. And this followed something else unprecedented. Last October's No Kings rallies became the largest coordinated protest in American history. Not the largest of the decade, not the largest since the Women's March, the largest ever. Hundreds of thousands of people flooded the streets across the country, a visible rejection of authoritarianism. And those rallies came just months after the massive protests in June. These movements aren't fading, they're growing. Something is waking up in this country, which brings us back to that 3.5% rule. Political scientists Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan studied hundreds of movements around the world, and their finding was consistent. No government has successfully crushed a sustained, nonviolent movement once it mobilized just 3.5% of the population. It's not magic. It's math. At that point, elite consensus fractures. The cost of repression becomes higher than the cost of reform. Power bends or breaks. Now, the United States has about 340 million people. 3.5% is roughly 12 million Americans. We're not there yet. But we are building the infrastructure to get there. Because what's emerging isn't just protests, it's political consciousness. When 1,000 protests spontaneously appear across the country within hours of a tragedy, that's not organization, that's culture. That's a population that has internalized resistance as a default response to injustice. And here's what conventional political analysis misses. Protests just don't pressure governments. They transform the participants, the people who participate in them. Every person who showed up to a No Kings rally or an ICE out for good vigil made a choice. Visibility over safety, solidarity over comfort, action over complicity. And those choices compound. The person who attends their first protest becomes the person who organizes the next. The spontaneous gathering becomes a coalition. Courage spreads because courage is contagious. And that's exactly what we saw after Renee Good's death. In city after city, people who had never protested before showed up. People who didn't know they had it in them. And once they found it, they didn't give it back. That's how movements grow. Not top down, bottom up. The No Kings rallies didn't just send a message. They created a newly energized constituency. Suddenly, resistance to authoritarianism wasn't politically risky. It was politically viable. And the protests over Renee Good's murder are already changing the immigration debate. Officials who stood silent are now demanding accountability. Media coverage has shifted. Polling shows ICE is historically unpopular. These aren't small wins. They're the preconditions for structural change. Civil rights leaders understood this. The March on Washington wasn't just a gathering. It was proof that change was already underway. When 250,000 Americans stood on the National Mall, the impossible became inevitable. And we're living through a similar inflection point. Americans are developing muscle memory for resistance. Each protest makes the next one easier. Each gathering expands the network. Each action reinforces the idea that citizenship means more than voting. It means showing up. So do protests work? Well, look what's already changed. A year ago, most analysts would have said Americans wouldn't take to the streets for abstract democratic principles, that a single ICE killing would generate a news cycle and fade away. Instead, we got the largest protests in American history. We got dozens of cities mobilizing within hours. We got a movement that didn't wait for permission. That's not failure, that's transformation. The streets are just the beginning, but they are a necessary beginning. And right now, more Americans than ever are discovering that they aren't alone, that their outrage is shared, that their actions matter. This is what the birth of a political movement looks like. Not perfect, not finished, but unmistakably alive. And so the real question isn't whether protests work. The question is, are we ready